Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Have you ever, tried to catch fog in a glass jar?
Oh, man. That is quite the mental image.
Right. Just picture yourself standing out in a field on a chilly, damp autumn morning.
Okay, I'm there.
So the mist is thick all around you. You can see it rolling over the grass. You can, feel the chill of it clinging to your jacket.
Yeah, it feels super physical.
Yes. It seems so incredibly physical. You feel like you can just grab a handful of it. So you hold out your glass jar, you scoop the air in front of you, and you slam the lid shut as fast as you can.
Let me guess, there's nothing in there.
Nothing. The second you hold that jar up to the morning light, expecting to see your captured prize swirling around inside, there is absolutely nothing there.
Just empty space?
Just empty space.
Yeah.
Because the moment you try to grasp it, to bend that vapor to your own will and put it on a shelf to examine it, it slips right through your fingers.
That is such a frustrating feeling to imagine.
It really is. And welcome to our deep dive for today, because today we are looking directly at the hidden, bubbling anxiety you likely feel every single time you attempt to plan your life.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we are going right for the throat today.
We really are, because you, the listener, you have this intense, burning desire for control. We all do.
Right. We have a desperate need to hold the glass jar and dictate what goes inside it.
Well, spot on. But that desire is constantly colliding with the sudden, uncontrollable changes that happen daily.
Like a sudden phone call from a doctor.
Yes, or a massive shift in the global economy. Or just, a weird email from your boss.
Yeah, the stuff that just derails your whole week.
Right. And we try to comfort ourselves with that secular platitude. Everything happens for a reason.
Oh, people say that all the time.
All the time. We say it to smooth over the chaos, to put a Band-Aid on the anxiety. But in this conversation, we are going to look at the staggering theological reality hiding behind that phrase.
So what is our mission for today's deep dive?
Our mission today is to examine a specific ancient text based on a massive stack of sources we brought into the studio. We have theological commentaries, historical analyses, and exegetical notes, all focused on Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 15.
Okay, so the time for everything passes.
Yeah, but we are moving far past the common sentimental use of that poem. You hear it at high school graduations.
Yeah, or at funerals.
Right. It's usually printed on a nice sunset background as a comforting little thought. But instead, the sources we are looking at today force us to confront the unyielding reality of divine sovereignty over every single second of human history.
Wow. Okay, that image of the fog in the glass jar is actually the perfect starting point for the material we are reviewing.
How so?
Well, because it captures the precise literal meaning of the Hebrew word hebel.
Hebel. Okay, spell that out for us.
H-E-B-E-L. That specific word is used 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And if you translate it directly, it means vapor or breath.
Vapor, so literally the fog in the jar.
Right. The core argument running through our sources is that life, when evaluated strictly from a horizontal, earthly perspective, is completely ungraspable.
It's just fog.
Yes. The book of Ecclesiastes gives us an unvarnished look at what happens when human beings try to manufacture their own control over the universe.
So we are analyzing a text that basically systematically dismantles human arrogance.
Spot on. The commentaries we are looking at demonstrate that true joy in a fleeting world is found not in deciphering some secret blueprint, but in humbly bowing before a sovereign creator.
And resting in a perfectly timed plan.
Right.
I want to break this down from the very beginning, because to understand the weight of what is being said, we have to establish who is saying it.
Oh, absolutely. The perspective of the author carries massive historical weight here.
Yeah, if we miss who is writing this text, we miss the entire thrust of the argument. So our historical sources identify the author as Solomon.
Writing during the United Monarchy in the 10th century BC.
Right. But I know there's a lot of debate about that in academic circles.
Oh, a ton of debate, yes. The historical context provides the necessary grounding for the theology we are about to unpack. The text identifies the speaker as Koheleth.
Koheleth, which means what?
It translates to the preacher or the assembler, and it identifies him as the son of David, king in Jerusalem.
Oh, Solomon.
Right. But we need to be very clear about how our sources handle this. The commentaries we are using strictly reject the attempts by liberal theology to late date this book.
Wait, stop right there and explain what that means. What is liberal theology in this context? And why would they want to change the date of when the book was written?
So in biblical scholarship, there is a critical school of thought that often assumes a naturalistic view of history.
Okay.
They look at the text of Ecclesiastes and argue that Solomon could not have written it in the 10th century BC.
Why not?
They try to place the writing of the book hundreds of years later in the post-exilic or Hellenistic periods.
So that would be long after Israel returned from Babylonian captivity.
Yeah, closer to the time of the Greek Empire. Their argument is largely based on linguistic theories.
Like the actual words being used.
Right. They point to certain Hebrew words and claim they are Persian loanwords or Aramaic expressions that just, would not have existed in Solomon's vocabulary.
So the assumption is that someone else wrote it and just used the persona of Solomon as a literary device.
You got it.
So they are saying it is a piece of historical fiction pretending to be Solomon.
Correct. But the historical analyses we are reviewing push back on that heavily.
Good, because that completely changes how you read the book.
Right. They argue that those linguistic theories fall apart under intense scrutiny. The language used is entirely consistent with a highly educated international monarch living in the 10th century BC.
Someone who had trade relations across the known world.
Exactly. I mean, he would have known those foreign loanwords. So the sources stand firmly on the historical reality of Solomonic authorship.
And that authorship matters immensely to the actual argument of the book.
Oh, absolutely. Solomon possessed a level of wealth, geopolitical influence, and intellect that was completely unmatched in the ancient Near East.
He was considered the wisest man on earth.
Yeah, and he had the unlimited resources to fund literally any experiment his mind could conceive.
If anyone had the budget to try and fill the glass jar with fog, it was Solomon.
100%. He had no financial or political limitations whatsoever.
Right, and when you read the first 2 chapters of Ecclesiastes, it reads like a grueling empirical experiment.
It really does. He systematically tests everything the material world has to offer.
He tries madness, he tries folly, he tries wine.
Then he moves on to massive architectural projects.
Oh, huge ones. We're talking about building sprawling houses, planting vineyards, creating entire gardens and parks.
With complex irrigation systems.
Right. He accumulates literal mountains of silver and gold. He acquires singers and concubines. He throws his unmatched genius-level intellect into human wisdom.
And he is searching for one specific thing.
Yes. He wants permanent gain. Sources use a specific Hebrew word for that, right?
Yeah, the Hebrew word is yitron.
Yitron.
It translates to a surplus, an advantage, something left over that you get to keep permanently.
Like a cosmic compound interest that survives the grave.
That is a brilliant way to put it. Solomon wants a return on his investment that death cannot touch.
He wants to know that all his sweat, all his building, all his thinking actually amounted to a permanent notch on the universe.
Right. But his conclusion after running all these massive experiments is that life under the sun is entirely Hebel.
It is absurdity.
It is vapor.
Let us clarify that phrase, under the sun, because the sources lean on it heavily. What does that mean practically?
So, under the sun is Solomon's specific phrase for evaluating existence from a purely horizontal earthly perspective.
Meaning, completely divorced from divine revelation.
Right. It is looking at life locked inside the physical universe with no thought of heaven or God's perspective.
And when you look at life only through that lens, his conclusion is that everything is vapor.
He realizes a devastating, inescapable truth. Even the wisest man on earth dies exactly like the fool.
Wow. Yeah. The man who builds an empire, who sets up trusts and foundations and legacy projects, eventually he just stops breathing.
He dies. And he leaves all his wealth to someone who might be an absolute fool.
Someone who did not work for it and might squander it in a week.
Right. All the humans striving in the world cannot secure a permanent advantage over death.
And the exegetical notes we have insist that we must ground this realization in Genesis chapter 3.
Oh, yes. That is a critical connection.
Because Solomon had unimaginable resources. I mean, he was taking in hundreds of talents of gold a year.
But even he could not reverse the curse of Eden.
Right. Back in Genesis, God pronounced a curse on the ground. Thorns, thistles, and painful toil became the baseline human condition.
Solomon could build the most beautiful, exotic vineyard in the world, importing plants from across the globe.
But he still had to deal with the sweat of his brow.
Yeah, he still had to deal with weeds, decay, and the fact that his own body was breaking down.
But this brings me to a question regarding Solomon's own spiritual state. I am looking at Solomon's life, and I'm confused.
Okay, what's the confusion?
This guy had literal divine wisdom given to him. But we know from the historical books like Kings that he ended up worshiping idols.
He did. He married hundreds of foreign wives.
He brought their false gods into Israel, and he built altars for them. So how can we trust a book about the meaning of life from a guy who clearly lost his way so badly? Does his personal failure completely discredit the text?
It's a valid question. But the commentaries argue that his failure actually amplifies the brutal honesty of the text.
Really? How so?
It proves the very point he is making. The book of Ecclesiastes is read as the retrospective reflection of a repentant monarch at the end of his life.
Ah, okay, so he's looking back.
Right. He chased autonomy and self-rule to its absolute furthest limits. He tasted everything the world offered, including the dark, forbidden, idolatrous things, and he found it tasting like ash in his mouth.
He had all the covenantal advantages of Israel.
He had the law of Moses, he had the promises of God, he was sitting on the throne of the Davidic lineage,
Yet he tried to find satisfaction outside of covenantal obedience.
and his personal failure proves that intellectual brilliance without the fear of God is a dead end.
So when he sits down to write chapter 3, he is writing as a man who knows firsthand that trying to master the universe and act like your own God is a crushing, impossible burden.
Absolutely.
So for the listener who is stressing out right now because they did not get that promotion or their 5-year plan just fell apart, they're feeling that exact same crushing burden.
Oh, for sure.
If life is a vapor we cannot grasp, the text naturally moves to answer the question, who is actually holding the jar?
Right. Who is in control of the timeline?
And that brings us to the famous poem in chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. It starts with, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven."
And then he launches into these 14 couplets.
Right, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted.
A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up.
Those verses give us 28 polar opposites. The literary term for this is a merism, right?
Yes. The sources point out that this is a rhetorical device where an author states two extreme opposite points to encompass absolutely everything that falls in between them.
Explain how a merism works in everyday language so we can really grasp it.
A common example is when someone says, "I searched high and low for my lost keys."
Right. They do not mean they only look at the ceiling and then only looked at the floorboards.
No, they mean they looked everywhere. High and low are the brackets that contain the entire room.
So when Solomon says, a time to be born and a time to die, he is putting brackets around the entirety of human existence.
From your first breath to your last breath, and every single moment in between.
From war to peace, from planting to uprooting, these couplets cover the entire spectrum of human life.
And the linguistic breakdown provided in the exegetical notes is fascinating here. The author uses two distinct Hebrew words for time in verse 1.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, he uses Zeman, which refers to a fixed predetermined epoch or a blueprint in the heavens.
Zeman.
Then he uses the word et, which refers to the actual occurrence or event playing out on Earth.
I want to make sure I understand the distinction. So Zeman is the master schedule written out in the architect's office, and et is the actual swinging of the hammer on the construction site down on the ground.
That is a very accurate way to conceptualize it. The commentaries argue there is a fixed decree established in heaven, the Zeman, which is then flawlessly executed as a specific event in the flow of history, the ets.
And the grammar of these verses drives this point home aggressively. The poem is a relentless sequence of infinitive constructs.
To be born, to die, to weep, to laugh.
Notice what is deliberately missing from that structure. There are no explicit human subjects in any of these clauses.
Right. He doesn't say a time for a man to choose the day he is born.
Well, I mean, spot on. The syntactic structure shifts the locus of control away from the human creature and places it entirely somewhere else.
Think about the agricultural couplet. A time to plant and a time to pluck up. A farmer can choose the day he puts the seed in the dirt.
But he does not control the rain.
He does not control the soil temperature, or the swarm of locusts that might come over the hill, or the amount of sunshine.
He is participating in a season he did not orchestrate.
And certainly, no human being chooses the hour of their own natural death. We are participants in a decree we did not write.
Let us get into the heavy theological frameworks that our sources use to interpret this, because this is where the debate gets intense.
Very intense.
The theological commentaries we are reading view this text through the lens of Reformed theology, specifically referencing the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Right. Chapter 3 of that confession states that God from all eternity did freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass.
And they use this exact passage in Ecclesiastes to argue that God is the sovereign architect of history.
Yes. The sources claim this crushes two other major theological viewpoints, open theism and Arminianism.
I need you to explain what those two terms mean, because we cannot just throw out jargon. What does an open theist actually believe about time and the future?
Okay, so open theism is the belief that God does not possess exhaustive, definite foreknowledge of the future free choices of human beings.
Wait, really? Not at all.
Right. The argument is that if human beings have genuine free will, the future must be open and unknowable, even to God.
Oh, wow.
In this view, God is moving through time alongside us, reacting to our choices and adjusting his plans on the fly.
Okay, and Arminianism is slightly different.
Yes, classical Arminianism affirms that God knows the future perfectly, but it argues that God's decrees are based on his foresight of what humans will freely choose to do.
Meaning what, practically?
It envisions a God who looks down the corridor of time, sees that a person will make a certain choice, and then bases his plan around that foreseen choice.
So to use a chess analogy, open theism says God is grandmaster playing a match, but he literally does not know what move you are going to make until you touch the piece.
Right. He's just so smart, he can always outmaneuver you.
And Arminianism says God already watched a tape of the chess match, so he knows your moves and plans his strategy based on what he saw you do.
That's a great way to summarize it.
But the reformed perspective from our sources says what?
The sources argue that Ecclesiastes rejects both of those views entirely. They argue that God did not watch a tape of the future, he wrote the script.
He wrote the script.
God, from all eternity, freely and unchangeably ordained the moves on the board. The seasons of life, the tragedies, the triumphs, the weeping, the dancing. They are not the product of blind chance, and they are not God reacting to human surprises.
They are appointed.
They are decreed. The sources point out that this is where the modern mind completely revolts.
Because the modern mind demands absolute autonomy.
Absolutely.
And this is where I have to push back hard on behalf of the listener, because a massive question comes up anytime you talk about a God who ordains absolutely everything.
Let's hear it.
Look at verse 3. It says, there is a time to kill. Look at verse 8. It says, there is a time to hate. If God writes the script and ordains whatsoever comes to pass, does the text give moral approval to all human actions just because they fall in the divine calendar?
That is a very common objection.
Are our sources arguing that God approves of a murder just because it happened on a Tuesday at the exact time he decreed it?
The sources anticipate that exact objection. They draw a very strict, impenetrable line between providential seasons and moral permissions.
Okay, unpack that.
Scripture, as a whole, absolutely forbids murder, and it forbids sinful, malicious hatred. The commentators argue that Koheleth is not giving us a grocery list of morally approved activities.
He is simply recognizing that in a fallen, cursed world, there are providential seasons that will include war, defensive killing, judicial execution, and the tearing down of corrupt nations.
Right.
So God can decree something to happen without giving a thumbs up to the sin involved.
Yes. The Westminster Confession is careful to state that while God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, he is not the author of sin, nor does he force the will of the creatures.
That's a heavy distinction.
It is. God's sovereignty includes hard, agonizing providences. He can decree that an event will occur without giving moral approval to the sinful human agents who carry it out.
Do the sources give an example of this from Scripture?
They frequently point to the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis as the ultimate case study for this.
Oh, yeah. His brothers threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery.
And that was a wicked, sinful, morally reprehensible act. But decades later, Joseph tells his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive."
God governed the timeline and the ultimate outcome. The final outcome.
Yes. But the brothers acted out of their own sinful desires and were fully morally culpable for their actions.
So the poem establishes this ironclad divine calendar. And because life is a vapor we cannot grasp, and God is the one holding the jar, the text moves to a very dark psychological place.
It really does shift gears.
We arrive at verse 9, which shifts the entire tone of the chapter. Solomon asks, what gain has the worker from his toil?
We move from a poetic observation of the seasons straight into philosophical agony.
Right. Because wait, if God has this ironclad calendar and I cannot change it, why should I even get out of bed to work?
Yeah, what's the point?
The text has to address this psychological burden.
And that question in verse 9 acts as a hinge for the entire chapter. It connects the objective reality of God's timing to the subjective, heavy psychological burden it places on humanity.
So what does verse 10 say?
It says, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with.
The Hebrew word for business there implies a heavy, exhausting task, doesn't it?
Yes. We are burdened by the reality of this calendar we cannot control. And then we hit verse 11, which the commentaries identify as the theological peak of the entire passage.
Let's look at verse 11. It says two very distinct, almost contradictory things. First, it says, He has made everything beautiful in its time.
Let's look at the word beautiful there.
Yeah, because when I think of war or death or uprooting, beautiful is not the word that comes to mind.
The Hebrew word used there is yafeh. It does not mean pretty in a sentimental way.
So what does it mean?
It denotes an aesthetic perfection or a fitting harmony. It means God's providential timing is never arbitrary.
Even when it looks chaotic or jagged to us.
Exactly. It possesses a moral and structural perfection. Even when it looks painful to our severely limited vision, everything fits perfectly into the master design.
And the second part of verse 11 is where the psychological tension really ratchets up. It says, also, He has put eternity into man's heart. Let's break that down.
The Hebrew word for eternity is olam, which refers to everlasting duration or antiquity. The commentators argue this is a description of the imago Dei, the image of God in man. We possess an innate ontological awareness that our lives are part of a grand, sweeping narrative.
We know instinctively that there is a past before us and a future after us.
Right. We are not beasts of the field. Think about it. An ox does not pause in the middle of plowing a field to ponder the meaning of its existence.
True. An ox is completely satisfied by immediate physical appetites. It wants grass, it wants water, it wants shade. Give an ox those things, and it is content.
But human beings are burdened with a longing for the whole story. We want to know how the tiny, fragmented events of our Tuesday morning fit into the grand design of the cosmos.
We demand to know why things happen.
Yes. But then the verse drops the hammer. It continues, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end.
The exegetical notes point out a specific Hebrew conjunction there, mibli asher. It translates to, yet so that not.
It acts as a hard divine restriction.
Right. God gives us the desire for eternity, but He actively suppresses the exhaustive knowledge of His plan.
It makes me think of an analogy.
Well, let's hear it.
Imagine you are staring at the back of a complex cross-stitch project.
Okay.
You see all these messy threads, jagged knots, chaotic colors, just overlapping each other in what looks like total random nonsense.
Right. It looks like a disaster from the back.
It does. But, because of the eternity placed in your heart, that a flawless, beautiful picture exists on the front of that canvas.
Oh, that's good.
The absolute agony of human existence is that God explicitly forbids you from turning the canvas around to look at the front.
That is a highly effective illustration of the exact tension Solomon is describing in verse 11. We see the knots, we see the pain, the seemingly random events, the time to weep, the time to lose, the unfairness of the world.
We know instinctively there is a master artist.
But we are denied the comprehensive view of His work, the modern demand to know exactly why God allows a specific tragedy.
Like, why did I lose my job? Why did my friend get sick? Is essentially a demand to flip the canvas over. It is a demand for divine omniscience.
And God says, no, the secret things belong to the Lord.
Right. The burden of the infinite resides within a finite human mind, and it causes massive existential frustration when we try to operate independently of divine revelation.
So for the listener right now who is looking at the back of the canvas, looking at the messy knots of their own life, the obvious question is, how are we supposed to live?
Yeah, what do we do?
If we cannot flip the canvas around to see the full picture, how do we survive the messy, confusing present? Do we just sit around in despair and wait to die?
This is where the commentaries point out a major transition to practical wisdom.
Because man cannot master the eternal decree, because we cannot hack the system to see the future, the logical inference in the text is to embrace temporal gifts.
Look at verses 12 and 13. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man.
Here we see the transition to what the sources call the good portion.
Since you cannot grasp the eternal decree, you must receive the temporal reality. But we need to spend some time clarifying the stark difference between biblical joy and worldly indulgence.
Yeah, because when Solomon says to eat, drink, and find pleasure in your work, He is not advocating for Epicurean escapism.
Right, he isn't saying, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, so nothing matters.
No, that is nihilism masquerading as a dinner party.
Exactly. What Solomon is teaching is submissive, covenantal gratitude. Godly wisdom receives the created physical gifts, things like your daily bread, a cup of coffee, a faithful spouse, honest labor in your mundane vocation.
And receives them with thanksgiving.
Right. The critical difference is that we receive them without demanding they function as our saviors. They are gifts from God, not gods themselves.
I want to push back on this conclusion because I can hear the modern listener raising a huge objection right now. Doesn't settling for just eating, drinking, and doing your daily work feel like throwing in the towel?
Well, think about the culture we live in.
We are constantly told we need to be hustling. We are told we should be striving to leave a massive legacy, to make our mark on the universe, to build a company or a movement that will outlast us.
Sitting down to just enjoy a simple meal and go to work the next day sounds like absolute defeat to a culture obsessed with greatness.
So how did the sources address this modern mindset?
They address it directly. They argue it only sounds like defeat if your main goal is to usurp the throne of God.
Wow.
The frantic, exhausting striving for a permanent legacy is, at its core, an attempt to achieve deity. It is an attempt to create your own yitron, your own permanent advantage against the wiping away of time.
But the harsh reality of Ecclesiastes is that time will eventually erase your legacy.
The buildings you put your name on will crumble or be renamed. The companies you build will be bought out and dismantled.
In 3 generations, your own descendants likely will not even remember your first name.
Recognizing that reality is not throwing in the towel, it is waking up from a delusion. The commentators suggest that receiving the ordinary means of grace, enjoying your dinner, loving your family, doing honest work without needing to be famous.
Is the actual cure for intellectual idolatry?
Yes, it is the realization that the ordinary moments are divine gifts meant to be experienced right now, rather than sacrificed on the altar of an anxious striving for an unknown future.
It is a radical shift in perspective. You stop trying to build a tower to heaven, and you start thanking God for the bricks he gave you to build a small house today.
That's a great way to think about it.
And the reason a person can actually rest in these simple gifts of today is found in the next 2 verses. We can rest in the micro level because the macro level plan is entirely secure. Look at verse 14. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it.
The language used there is absolute and uncompromising. God's work is forever. Human works are vaporous, but the divine decree is immovable.
You cannot add a single second to your appointed time to die.
And you cannot subtract a single moment of sorrow that God has ordained for your sanctification.
This truth cuts in 2 directions. It humbles the rebel who wants to escape God's will because he cannot.
And it humbles the religious pragmatist who thinks they can improve upon God's plan through their own cleverness or strategy.
And the text gives a stated motive for why God operates this way. It says he does it so that people fear before him. I think we need to define the fear of the Lord because that is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot but is rarely explained.
The fear of the Lord is a concept we have drastically watered down in modern theology.
Right.
The sources clarify that it is not a servile panic. It is not like a slave cowering in the corner before an unpredictable, abusive tyrant who might lash out at any second.
So what is it?
It is a reverential awe that forces you to bow the knee. It is the trembling recognition of divine majesty and absolute sovereignty.
When you realize that God's decrees are unchangeable and perfect, the only rational posture for a created being is submission.
Right. The frustration we feel at our lack of control is actually a grace designed to humble us. It brings us to the end of ourselves, so we will stop trusting our own intellect and fall upon his mercy.
That brings us to verse 15, which contains a cryptic yet incredibly impactful phrase. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away.
The Hebrew phrase there is iba quesh et nirdaf. Let's talk about divine record keeping.
Because time devours human memory. We forget things. Documents vanish in fires. Witnesses die.
And sinners flatter themselves that their old, secret transgressions have just dissolved into the mist of time.
But God is the ultimate flawless record keeper. God seeks what has been driven away.
The commentaries explain that he brings the forgotten past to his tribunal. He is the Lord of history who ensures that no event, no matter how fleeting or hidden, escapes his sovereign ledger.
This means that human history might seem novel and surprising to us, but it is never novel to God. What has been and what will be are ever present before his eyes.
I want to highlight the dual nature of this reality because it strikes in two completely opposite directions depending on who is listening.
Yeah, let's look at that. For the unrepentant person, the person who thinks they got away with their secret sins, this is absolute terror.
Right. Because time does not atone for sin. You cannot just wait out the clock on God's justice. He will drag every hidden thing into the light.
But for the oppressed, for the wronged, for the person whose faithful, quiet work went completely unnoticed by the world, verse 15 is a massive comfort. The judge of all the earth will do right. Your tears are not forgotten.
Precisely. It is a guarantee of perfect justice. The oppressor may think his deed is buried in the past, covered up by bribes or intimidation, but God retrieves what time has swept from human sight.
The sources point out that this prepares the soul to trust God even when earthly justice systems completely fail. So we have covered the Old Testament context. But where does this ancient, sobering wisdom land in the scope of redemptive history? We cannot just leave this in the Old Testament. As we look at the whole canon of Scripture, the theological sources point this directly to the New Testament.
It points to the Christological fulfillment of time.
The commentators argue that if we preach Ecclesiastes basically as practical advice for a vaporous life, if we just say, life is short, so enjoy your coffee, we are delivering a truncated moralistic message that falls entirely short of the gospel.
Right. The New Testament declares that the climactic answer to the agony of Ecclesiastes is Jesus Christ. They point specifically to Galatians chapter 4, verse 4.
Which says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law."
Notice the explicit language of time. The eternal Son of God, who transcends time completely, voluntarily subjected himself to the vapor of Hebel. He entered the timeline.
He stepped into the glass jar. Jesus, the second Adam, subjected himself to the time to be born in Bethlehem and the time to die on Calvary.
And when you look at the cross, the sources argue you see the highest resolution of all his extreme opposites, those merisms, in chapter 3.
The cross is the absolute focal point of God making everything beautiful in its time. Think about the couplets we discussed. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up.
The sources explain that at the cross, the Father was pleased to crush the Son, executing the righteous wrath due to our sins so that by his wounds we might be healed.
The tearing down of his physical body was the building up of the church. Romans chapter 5 tells us that, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly.
The crucifixion was not an accident of Roman politics. It was not a tragedy caused by Jewish hostility spinning out of control.
Though both the Romans and the religious leaders were morally responsible for their wicked actions.
Yes. But the cross was the perfectly timed, unchangeable decree of the Father.
It is an incredible irony. The ugliest, most unjust deed in all of human history. The crucifixion of the sinless Son of God became the absolute pinnacle of God making everything beautiful in its time. He overruled the greatest evil for the holiest purpose.
And the incarnation of Christ answers that agonizing tension we saw back in verse 11.
Yes, the tension of having eternity in our hearts but not being able to see the full picture on the front of the canvas.
The commentaries assert that in Christ the exact imprint of God's nature is revealed. We no longer have to stare blindly at the messy back of the cross-stitch canvas, wandering in the dark, wondering if God is actually good.
He has given us the definitive, historical proof of his goodness in the substitutionary atonement of his Son.
Now, the sources we are using operate from a specific theological framework regarding the end times. They operate from a premillennial and dispensational framework. We need to neutrally report on what that means and how it connects to Christ's authority over time.
Yeah, explain that framework for the listener.
The premillennial and dispensational view held by these authors teaches that God has distinct administrative eras or dispensations in history. They believe that Christ's authority over time guarantees the literal future fulfillment of covenant promises made to both the nation of Israel and the church.
They argue that Jesus Christ is the Lord of time, and his sovereignty guarantees that he will return physically to earth at his appointed season.
In this framework, he will establish a literal 1,000-year kingdom, permanently reversing the curse of Eden on the earth itself. The time to weep will be turned into an everlasting time to laugh.
This view suggests that history is moving toward a concrete geopolitical demonstration that God's timing is flawless.
Right.
Okay, we need to take all this rigorous theology and apply it forcefully to the immediate cultural moment and the personal struggles of the listener.
Our sources refer to this as utilizing the third use of the law, which is a theological concept that means using the law to guide the believer's grateful obedience in everyday life.
The sources use Ecclesiastes to dismantle several modern cultural movements and theologies. First, on the chopping block is the prosperity gospel. Let's report on how the authors critique it.
The sources offer an aggressive, systematic critique of the prosperity gospel. They view this teaching as entirely contradictory to the text of Ecclesiastes.
The prosperity gospel, often associated with the word of faith movement, promises believers that through positive confession, having enough faith, or sowing a financial seed into a ministry, they can command the universe to give them health and wealth.
Right. It teaches that you can entirely avoid the time to weep and the time to lose. The commentators argue that this is a crossless Christianity.
How does Ecclesiastes specifically dismantle that? What are the mechanics of the argument?
Well, Ecclesiastes dismantles it by showing that suffering, loss, and death are sovereignly ordained seasons for everyone, including the righteous. You cannot positively confess your way out of a time to die or a time to mourn.
The prosperity gospel attempts to hand-man the steering wheel of the universe. It tells you that your words control reality.
The sources argue this always ends in bitter disillusionment when tragedy inevitably strikes, because the believer assumes they just did not have enough faith, rather than resting in the sovereignty of God.
It is a theological tragedy that leaves people devastated when the time to mourn arrives. And connected to this intense desire for control is the epidemic of clinical anxiety we see today. The sources make a direct connection between trying to play God and having severe anxiety.
The argument is that a massive portion of modern anxiety is rooted in the idolatrous desire to be sovereign over our own lives. We are finite creatures trying to carry the weight of omniscience on our shoulders.
We want to know all the variables, we try to mitigate all the risks, and we attempt to guarantee our own safety and the safety of our children.
But you cannot carry that weight. Your shoulders were not built for it. The sources suggest that anxiety is often the natural fruit of demanding to be God.
The commentaries also present some very strong cultural critiques that we should report neutrally to understand the breadth of their application. They argue that trusting God's perfect justice, as seen in verse 15, where God seeks what is driven away, means society must reject certain modern ideologies.
Specifically, they call out critical race theory and systems built on perpetual grievance.
What is their argument there?
The argument drawn from the text is that human vengeance and societal division based on historical grievances are attempts to force justice on our own timeline and by our own metrics. The authors argue that because God is the ultimate record keeper who guarantees perfect justice, believers do not need to adopt secular theories of class warfare or racial grievance.
The sources favor a return to strict biblical justice. They advocate for complementarian roles within the family and church, and they focus on finding quiet, faithful contentment in the station God has placed you, rather than being swept up in egalitarian movements or endless cultural crusades.
And there is one more theological stance in these sources we need to cover. They mention a strict cessationist viewpoint when dealing with providence. Let's explain what cessationism is and how it relates to Ecclesiastes.
Cessationism is the theological view that the miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit, such as prophecy, speaking in tongues, and instantaneous healing, ceased with the end of the apostolic age and the closing of the biblical canon.
In relation to providence, the cessationist commentators argue that the heavens are not yielding new, private prophecies to help you decode your personal tragedies.
Meaning you don't need a secret word of knowledge from a self-proclaimed prophet to figure out why you lost your job.
Correct. The cessationist view argues that the closed canon of Scripture is entirely sufficient for the believer. You must trust the revealed character of God in the Bible, rather than demanding secret mystical knowledge to explain the providential events of your life.
They argue that looking for signs and new revelations is another way of trying to flip the cross-stitch canvas over.
To bring this all together into a practical mindset for the listener, there is an analogy in the sources pointing to Psalm 131. It compares the anxious modern mind, a mind constantly demanding answers, constantly trying to decode providence, constantly terrified of the future, to an unweaned child.
Imagine a baby who is hungry. They scream, they thrash, they turn red in the face. They are completely agitated because they are not getting what they want immediately.
But contrast that with a weaned child. A weaned child rests quietly against its mother's chest. The child is completely content just to be held. The child trusts the parent without demanding an explanation for every single movement the mother makes.
That is the highest posture of holy contentment. The weaned child has learned through experience that the parent is good and provides what is needed at the right time. The commentators argue that the mature believer must reach a point where they can say, "My times are in your hands. I do not understand why this specific painful season has arrived, but I know you are good, and I will rest in your arms without demanding an audit of your decisions."
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We have looked at how life is fleeting and vaporous. We have looked at how God flawlessly orchestrates the calendar of human events down to the second.
We have seen how he deliberately hides the full picture to crush our pride, and how he offers daily joy in Christ's finished work on the cross as our true rest. The overall message from these sources is clear. Do not waste your breath fighting the sovereign decree.
You cannot edit his timeline. You cannot add to it, and you cannot subtract from it. Your greatest wisdom is found in reverent fear and humble joy in the present moment.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. I want you to identify one painful, confusing, or frustrating season in your life right now. Look at your life. Maybe it is a major career setback. Maybe it is a chronic health issue that will not go away. Maybe it is a severely strained relationship with a family member. You have probably been trying to rush past it. You've been trying to manipulate it or constantly decode exactly why it is happening to you. I challenge you to wake up tomorrow morning, sit still within that exact season, and acknowledge it aloud as a deliberate, unchangeable stroke of the master's brush. Trust the Father's timing without demanding to see the finished canvas on the other side. Stop trying to catch the fog in the glass jar. Let the mist roll over you. Feel the chill on your skin, and know that the Lord of the weather is holding you fast.